But welcome to my attention, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, we are slipping on time, but I could talk fast. If you ask my wife, I either talk way too fast or I don't talk at all. There's like no middle ground there. So my name's William. I work for Itential. We build a platform for automation and orchestration. And just a little about me. I don't want to talk too much about myself, but I spent 15 years in the enterprise, financial services and healthcare, and then made a mid-career pivot to the startup space. I've worked for a few startups, very different worlds. I'm glad I did. I've learned a ton. And today what I really want to talk about is being strategic when we think about like how do we approach this AI-enabled world. So if you're on the customer side, and this is a double-edged sword, so the vendor side, just being on the vendor side, I realize that a lot of times, there's a gap to understanding our customers better. So I want to look at some strategic things, which is really hard to do after the lineup of great speakers and the demos and like all the cool stuff. I might sound like a little bit of a Debbie Downer. Hopefully I don't put anybody to sleep or myself to sleep, but we'll continue to go. So I want to look at the status quo bias because when I was on the customer side, this is something that I felt impacted things constantly. We have a status quo, and then we have a bias where we're just resistant to like change. So I want to look at kind of what that looks like. And then I want to look at adoption patterns in the business. So I think this is really important because, John Capobianco has been pushing out content since ChatGPT was released. He's been, making a lot of great stuff. And a lot of that stuff in the earlier time frame, I would look at it as like, okay, in the enterprise, I'm very concerned and I'm very much interested in what we can actually operationalize. What can we adopt? Like, what can we actually deploy? And then when I came to the startup side, it became, okay, well, we've got to sell software. What can we sell? And with AI, MCP, A to A, there's so much stuff out there. There's so many things that just kind of fall through the cracks. It's hard to understand this world. And then you can't do anything today without talking about agentic NetOps a little bit. So we'll look at kind of I think that'll be the Debbie Downer part of my conversation, but I think it's important anyhow. And then kind of like where are vendors at? So I have I think a few of the statistics I have already been referenced from Gartner, but I think they're important nonetheless. So, looking at actual adoption and what will it take to adopt? And I think it was a Total Network Ops I think it was your conversation, Jeremy, with Total Network Ops. It might have been you where you were talking about, a lot of vendors don't even know what MCP is at this point, which is kind of my experience as well. So we have vendors on one end of the spectrum that are like, what is this stuff? Oh, it's not going to make us money. We're not concerned about it. But then you have the other end of the spectrum where you have like the selectors of the world. You have, we're doing some really neat things at Itential, and there's other vendors that are kind of like leading that charge. So we'll look at what that looks like. And, this status quo bias, I actually tried to use AI to replace his face with Scott's face because they kind of look a little bit alike anyway. I couldn't get it just right, though, so I stuck with the original meme. But I actually changed my whole talk track. So after John asked me to present, I think it was a day or two later, I went to lunch with someone that I know that leads network ops for a pretty big company. And this person is like anti-MCP, anti-AI, like this stuff is just snake. Like when I sat down, he said, here's the MCP snake oil salesman. I was like, whoa, have you heard of John Capobianco? I'm not that bad, am I? Come on.
Anyone selling snake oil around here?
Kidding, you gotta laugh at our...
That's right. Maple flavored snake oil.
So we got to laugh at ourselves a little bit, right? I got to make sure you all don't go to sleep. So we started to have this conversation, and I immediately keyed in on, because I think MCP is really, like when I talked about the enterprise versus the startup, what's happening and what's important for me there versus what's important to me there, I saw MCP as this thing that makes it adoptable in the enterprise. Like this is the catalyst here that's really going to make this thing springboard enterprises into like a different way of thinking, hopefully. And And as we started talking, I was convinced that I was going to convince this person that MCP was a real thing that maybe you should be concerned about. And so in my own career, I got so tired of networking at one point that I jumped ship and went straight to cloud. I'm tired of fighting fires. I'm tired of repeating history. Everything, like, I just got very frazzled at a point in my career, and I just said, I'm not doing networking stuff anymore. And of course, I'm back in networking a few years later, but in the cloud space, things are just a little bit different set of problems, but yeah. So we start chatting, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to go back in the time machine a little bit, back to when I did NetOps, because I worked in a NOC at one point and did my dues in network operations, and I was like, okay, I'm just going to look back and talk through, a complicated process that we had, and then kind of like try to, type how MCP could make this better. Maybe that'll, change his mind a little bit. So I was like, okay, back, this is pre-SD-WAN days, and we had, most of our sites at this enterprise I worked at, like the critical sites would have like 2 different MPLS providers. And one common theme is, hey, circuits go down, and, this is a thing that happens. So I guess you'd say they're dual-homed. You're dual-homed to multiple providers, and in that day, usually what you would do is you'd use path prepend. So when primary provider has problems, you're failing over to the secondary. But a lot of times what would happen is you have this provider issue where routes are being, rapidly withdrawn and rapidly re-advertised, and then the primary is, becoming the primary again, and then you have like traffic oscillating back and forth, and at the end of the day, the business is suffering. They think it's a complete network outage because it's that bad. And so, like, what we would have to do at that point in time is we had these run books, and we have to go through and create our ticket. Then we have to create the provider ticket, and then we'd share tickets. And we have all this information we'd have to do. And then at the end of the day, what we'd end up doing is just shutting down a BGP peer to make sure that, we're using a secondary and nothing's going to happen. But we had to do all these things before we could do that, including an on-call change management ITIL certified person that we would have to talk to and share our tickets with before we could log in and do our things in the CLI. And this is, as I'm talking through this, he stops me. He's like, wait. And he kind of looks at me confused. And he's like, you're describing what we do today. And I was like deer in headlights. I didn't know what to say. I was like, oh, so nothing has really changed, apparently. I was like, what about SD-WAN? What about BFD? What about all these new things? Well, yeah, but the processes and all the things that you're describing, which are very difficult, that's kind of what we're doing today. So then my mind pivots to like, okay, I don't even care about trying to convince this person MCP is a thing. I just want to understand. So I started asking questions like, why? And a lot of the things that I was getting back is, hey, we're fighting fires. We're busy. Our engineering team's been leaned out. We have to do more with less. We don't have time. My team is exhausted. I have high turnover rate. And he's saying all the things that I remember saying when I was in ops. I'm just like, wow, okay. So the conversation didn't go exactly like I planned, but I learned a lot. And I learned that, it's one thing when I haven't been in the vendor side for that long, but I haven't been in network ops for a very long time. And if you build network products, it's really important to understand where your customers are at, and you got to know that they're not all in the same place at the same time. And one thing he said too, and I ended up putting this in here, he ended up saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that is a phrase I used so many times in the past that, it kills me looking back. But one thing that I translate this to now is, if it ain't on fire, like at this very second right now, don't fix it. Like that's kind of the new, if it ain't break, don't fix it. So next is, and this to the right here, like this should not be surprising to anybody. We all know this. Human hands cause outages. We fat finger things. I've caused my fair share of outages. Shouldn't surprise us. Human error directly or indirectly contributes to 2/3 to 4/5 of all downtime incidents. That's a lot, but I see stuff like this and I'm like, okay, not whatever, bad, but we already know this. But where this really starts to become alarming is when people really start to care is when you start looking at cost. So what does an outage cost these days? $400 billion annual cost of downtime for the Global 2000. How many Ferraris can you buy for that? Has anybody done those numbers? Equating to 9% of their profits. And I'm going to post these slides. I have like a talks repo on GitHub, and I'll post them up there if you all want to go and like look at these studies. But some of these studies, I've been looking at it for a while now, just purely to understand, not even to present or anything. But there's some this study especially is really well done with Splunk and Oxford Economics. The next one, average cost of an unplanned outage. You start getting into the hours and the minutes, and you're like, it starts to become a little more real. A lot of folks, you're like, oh, this many trillion. And they're like, I don't know how many billion that is. It's just high numbers. But when you get down to the minutes and the hours, that's a lot. And the thing that's shocking is a 10% increase from 2022. And I looked that up in some other places as well. And there's some altering statistics there, but for the most part, it shows a dramatic increase. And I see this and I'm thinking, wait, 2002 or 2022? Because we're only in 2025. Like, not much time has passed, and this has increased 10%. Even if it's increased 5%, that's still too much in that short.
Automation.
Huh?
Is that because of automation?
That's a good question.
In fact, that implies that we're actually getting worse at this as 9 was up.
Yeah, I think you have to look at the data collectively as a whole, but I think there's more technologies, more complexity, more ways to do things.
And situation, even business to go to my employees for data or as well.
Yeah. And the last one, I don't even know if this is super relevant, but in my mind, whenever I see stuff like this, I always think, what is the sector that's just getting blown away? Who's like the worst, that's, taking it the worst? And it's this in this circumstance, it's retail, which is surprising when you think about it. But yeah, 287 million in the Global 2000 for retail. Woo! It's a lot. So as we start to think this is a major problem. And I think some of these problems that there's a lot of companies that are actively trying to figure these things out, big companies. And as we try to figure these out, one of the things that I would always try and do when I worked for big enterprises, understand how are actually decisions made at this place? Because every company I've worked at, decisions seem to be made differently, and it's really hard to actually figure that out. And also, I'm going to get to the slide. How does technology proliferate and create a market? I think that's a good starting point because I love this diffusion of innovations theory. I've used this in a few slides over the past few years, but it kind of ties nicely with, I forget who had the Gartner hype cycle in their deck, but you can kind of almost layer these on top of that. So you have, and I'm going to use some hockey references. I love hockey. I played hockey. It's my favorite sport, yada, yada, yada. But these innovators, the trailblazers, they're not worried about, they're not following where the puck is going. They're inventing where the puck is going. They're building the stadium. They're doing the lights. They're doing everything. They have these gigantic engineering teams. Like, who knows how many engineers Google has? If you look at all the work DeepMind is doing, like so much R&D, so much like real research and just building, always striving for the cutting edge. So the Googles and the, Amazon, AWS of the world. And then you have the early adopters, like super visionary companies. And I couldn't help, when I was watching Greg's presentation, I see them as kind of like visionaries, early adopters that are doing it before anybody else does. And, this is really where you get into the point of, okay, you made that pass and they're skating to where that puck is going. They're doing what a hockey player should do there. And, there's a very, there's a lot of value to being, when you look at the market that you exist in, learning what's going to work and what's going to drive innovation. And it gives you a strategic advantage in that market. And then you have all the folks in the middle, the pragmatists, and they're a little more risk averse. They want to understand all the risks. They analyze all the risks, and they're going through and they're understanding all the data and they're following the trajectory of that puck. Like, is a defender going to come out of nowhere and like hip check me into next week and take my legs out? Like, what's going to happen? They understand all the things and analyze it. But then when they make that decision to run, they're going and they're deploying that technology. And that's sort of like where I think the market actually gets created. And then we have the late majority, the skeptics. They're reacting. I'm going to get out of the way here. So they're kind of reacting to where the puck already went. Like, the pass has already been made, and they're just playing catch-up. They're in a perpetual state of playing catch-up all the time. And a lot of times they're changing out of necessity, not necessarily for the, what's going to give them a competitive advantage over all the other companies in the market. And then the traditionalists, the laggards, they're skating around in their own zone and all the hockey games happening in front of them. And, until something absolutely has to happen, okay, like these certs are expired. We've got to do something now. So, and a lot of times I've talked to so many companies that fall in these two categories, and it's not one thing, it's many things. It's like how much money is in the bank, like a lot of layover, a lot of changes in leadership, all sorts of things happen that sort of, lead to this being a thing. And so as we dig down a little more, the reason I'm so bullish on MCP, and one thing I like to think of is like in big companies nowadays, they're not just picking one or two vendors. Like, I have this vendor, they can just do all the things. I just want one vendor to yell at when something goes wrong. Oh, it would be nice. More and more as technology has evolved, as cloud is blown up, and you have all these, AI, LLMs, and all the, hey, we want an agentic network operations center so we don't have to have humans anymore, like all this stuff. It's really important to understand that, like, wherever we do want to get to, we have to understand where we're coming from. We have to understand and I like to liken I say pre-MCP orchestration of capabilities, but if I'm being honest with myself and everybody in this room, this is where a lot of companies just are today. Because all this, I've heard so many times from so many presenters where we are so in the early days. Like, MCP this last November. Like, we're not even a year into MCP being out there in the wild. So this is going to take a while, as we'll see in a second from some Gartner statistics. So the thing that I think about when I think about this Great Wall era is kind of, I think it was Scott, you were talking about the VPs that are going out to all the nice dinners or something, and the whining and dining culture. And I remember being there when I was at the bottom and, seeing all these VPs go out to dinners and stuff and then saying, hey, this is what we're doing. This is what you're going to do. And not having any say-so in that process to evaluate some of these technologies sometimes. And RFP processes are so extensive, like having done these on both the customer side and the vendor side now, they're exhausting. My favorite RFP that I ever did was the first one, because I didn't know how crazy it was going to get, because these can last for like a year or longer. They take a long time, depending on the industry you work in and the risk tolerance and the folks involved with the decision making. That's a long time to decide what you're going to use for SD-WAN. I'm sure we have better things to do and better ways to use all these human resources that we want to get rid of. Like, what's happening here? And the custom integrations, all the consultants of Middle Earth converge upon you to help you with these integrations, and then you pay them to manage these complicated integrations over time. This is, very complicated. And, switching vendors, that's one thing I do have a lot of experience with. And actually, the last data center project I worked on was, I shouldn't say too much, but we ripped out one SDN, a vendor with an SDN solution, and put in another one. And the one that we had it was fine. It was doing its job. We had no problems. It was like we're running out of problems. We just need to find something new to work on. I don't know. So, and then, the integration methodology, I see this now and I'm like, well, I put together some of these slides at like 2 a.m. and I must have had network and automation on the mind, point-to-point API connections. So a lot of times custom integrations, you have your vendors and then you have a partner or something in the middle. And really what's happening is they're just point-to-point, that is what it is, point-to-point API connections. They have an API, hopefully. And then that you're not in control though. Like when stuff needs to be managed or stuff needs to be changed or additions need to happen or this thing needs to be matured, it's a lot of people. It's very tedious. And then I already mentioned the custom middleware, extended duration and the data silos. I think this has been touched on a lot, but these great pockets of data that we have everywhere, not being able to pull them together and actually, it's great that I can go and I can look at data here and I can get maybe an answer I need for something. But when you start combining these data from different places, that's when you start getting insights into that data that actually can have a positive impact on your team and on the vertical you work in the business. And then decision making, I kind of already touched on this. Committee-based decision making. A lot of times the committee making the decision to adopt the technology is very far removed from the technology. And a lot of times I've seen this a lot, like it's almost like we're dealing in absolutes where we either have, the most risk averse enterprise grade stability over on the left, and then over on the right, we have innovation. If you do innovation, you're going to just take the world down. So you got to keep that over here. We're going to be using the stable stuff and we're not going to do new things. When in reality, it's all based on the business. Like what is your risk profile? And are you trying things? Are you doing R&D? Do you understand the technology enough to tie it back to how your business operates? So there's a lot of things there that have to be considered. And so imagine all this stuff, all these things that I just complained about for 5 minutes, and imagine what would this look like in a post MCP world. And this is, some of these things are backed in data. Some of these are kind of like my opinion a little bit, but I think as far as like vendor relationships are going to be concerned in the future, they're going to be more agile. They're going to be more modular. You're going to have the ability to probably flip vendors quicker if you need to. That's going to be easier. I'd say like to every vendor on the planet, like make your product easy to evaluate, because if you go into like a RFP or somebody's going to do a POC and it's just super hard to use your technology, your competition's gonna eat you alive. So in this post MCP world, it's got to be easy to test out, because I have like 3 or 4 burner email accounts that I use with I test stuff all the time just to kind of understand what's out there. So many companies have a free tier now. I test it out, and usually within like an hour or two, or much less a lot of times, I know if this is going to work or not, or if it does what I need it to do or not. So this gives the customer the ability to do a lot of work up front. And plug and play mentality, I think the best definition I've found for MCP that I've heard a few times over the past few months is plug and play. I think that's sort of the gist of it. And the portfolio approach. So like vendor, like you have a startup that's in that first bucket that comes to market, and they do 2 things really well. Like that's their core value proposition. But then the VCs start digging in. We need to expand, and that means you need to do more things. They do another round of funding, and then it's a network vendor encroaching on security things, or a security vendor encroaching on network things, and then, well, I like the core things you did there, but you're not a security company or you're not a network company. This other vendor I want to use for that. So I'm taking these 2 things here and these things here, and what you end up with is really like a strategic portfolio. So going on to integration methodology, standards. And this is what gets me so excited about MCP. We have the protocol. It's not vendor specific that I'm going to learn. It's not it's not iOS CLI sort of thing. No, it's a standardized protocols, which makes, and that's where like going back to like, this is where it gets real and this is where it starts to become adoptable, is when you have things like this happening. And then these natural language interfaces, this has already been touched on so many times, but I am persuaded that UIs are going to become so simple, so uncluttered, And a lot of the ways that in the future we're going to interact with things is through natural language. You're still going to have UIs, and they're still going to be getting prettier and prettier, hopefully, as the years go on. But you're going to rely less on going and pointing and clicking around all these user interfaces to do a thing. And then real-time data sharing, cross-platform intelligence. I kind of talked about that in the last slide. The value of taking, not having to understand and take all the data from this big data lake or data warehouse or a beach house, whatever they're going to call it next, depending on the size. Taking little tidbits from here and there to put together intelligence for something that's really important for what I'm doing. And then that leads to these sort of composable designs, mixing and matching of capabilities across vendors. And then this is kind of where this is more me than any data, but I say that, but I honestly, like, when thinking about when I first got into cloud, I said this same thing. I'm going to be honest. I'm like, okay, the intelligence is going to move to the business user unless, IT is going to wrap these guardrails around things and everybody's going to be empowered at the business user level to do things. And that didn't happen the way I think everybody thought it was going to happen. But I do think MCP is a catalyst for getting us closer to that. And then test, fail, and scale fast philosophy. I don't have to say much about that. I think we all understand it. And innovation, competitive pressure. You're going to have if you're not doing it, your competitors are going to be doing it. And guess what? They're going to start chipping away at your market share. That's going to hit the bottom line. So, yeah, you want to stay ahead of the competition. So, agentic NetOps, the thing that's going to give us humanless network operations centers. I think Dewan really hit on this so good. I feel like I can't outline it better than he did, but I'll just go through this quick. Goal-driven autonomous AI agents, independently from or on behalf of humans. And, transformation to a truly autonomous network with near real-time self-healing. I see self-healing everywhere still. That decreases reliance on human resources. And here's some of the characteristics. I'm not going to hit on every one of these, but I think this is an important. These get confused here. And if I take, actually, we just did an incredible integration and partnership with Selector to where it's sort of they have the intelligence and we do the automation. And I think our marketing team jumped straight to just out of the loop instead. And what you're really going to see here, though, is a big enterprise is never just going to go and say, okay, we're just going to trust both of these things and we're going to completely take the human out. It's probably going to be a multi-year, multi-phased approach if it is your intention to completely remove humans from a thing. But it's got to be incremental because it's like a line going left to right risk. Or trust, actually. So you're going to gain trust slowly with the human completely in the loop. And then you're going to have a human on the loop that's letting the AI do the things. And then such a time that you build up that trust and you've built up those reps and you've done this thing so many times and the outcomes are consistent, then, yeah, we'll take humans out. And yeah, we won't do those last two because I think those have been covered, pretty extensively so far. And I know Gartner gets a lot of hate. They really do, but I do a lot of reading. That's how I either learn by reading or conversations. That's kind of the gist of it. And I really happen to like Gartner's research, and I think the way that they do that research, they do a lot of, and it's not all perfect, and there's a lot of stuff that didn't pan out the way that a lot of us thought it would pan out, but they do this. If you look at their research methodology, the way they do inquiries to inform, the research that they're putting out there, a lot of it's pretty good, well educated research. So I do a lot of reading with Gartner, but these two things here stood out to me. And research points out that adoption today is less than 1% and describes vendor capabilities as embryonic. Okay, so yeah, I actually did a word search for embryonic in some of these docs, and it's mentioned several times. Sounds like a post-apocalyptic thriller, like Aliens, but Gartner estimates that 2/3 of network tasks are still performed manually. I guess we're all surprised by that one, indicating a multi-year journey just to get to the point where agentic systems are feasible. And, that's, I can definitely say that, automation, why do we have AutoCon? This has been, in my earlier days, network engineering, I was using SNMP, Perl, Expect, all these things in tandem to replace certs on, CSS load balancers. And when we fast forward to now, it's not that much different for a lot of companies out there. It's a script-driven culture where you can't scale what you've built out. Or if I worked for one company where I was getting phone calls for over a year to help with certain things when they broke. Just give me this, this is what we did. We upgraded one of them was they upgraded their version of Python on their servers, and that was just a nightmare for that guy. And that's when I was I stepped out and you got to figure this out. I'm far removed from working there. And then unfair business value. This has already been mentioned several times. 58% of orgs are open to using Gen AI. They want to. They see the potential value, but they're waiting for the clear use cases with proven business value. Now, we could debate what proven business value actually means, but I think this is a valid point. If you go to a big, gigantic, trusted vendor and you ask if they have MCP and they're like, what is MCP? That doesn't instill trust if you're on the customer side. It just doesn't. So strategic planning, by 2030, 50% of orgs will use agentic NetOps with minimal human involvement, up from nearly 0%. Can you believe that? That's a direct quote. Pretty game-changing right there. And by 2030, agentic NetOps are the network AI system, the primary UI used in network operations. Again, it's a bit of a, we'll see what happens. And low adoption rate is primarily due to limited vendor capabilities and organizational readiness to deploy. I think this is obvious. I think this is on the mark. Mainstream adoption is expected to take between 5 and 10 years. That's a big gap. 5 to 10 years, in between 5 and 10. That's a lot of years. So where are vendors today? And I tried to do a lot of research. I was actually going to pull in some of the non-cloud, non-hyperscale vendors with some examples, but it is pretty lagging right now because it is so new. And you got to think, it's not a knock on the big vendors, because the bigger you get and the more things you do, the more acquisitions you've made, you have a big ship that you've got to turn a little bit, and you have to deviate. You got to take resources and pull them away or hire new folks to work on new things, and people are already spread thin. So it's not a knock on big vendors. This is a hard thing to do, and this is so new. It's such in the early days. But kind of just to kind of give an overview of what we're doing specifically with Itential is my elevator pitch is really simple. It's, sorry marketing if you read this, I don't think it's on the marketing talking points, but I believe our platform, when I think about it, if I were a customer, the thing that would be valuable to me is it's basically a purpose built to orchestrate across federated systems. It's as simple as you can probably give a definition of what we do. And I think the important parts and the details, the devil's always in the details, but you have, if you have multi-process automation, you have stuff coming from CLIs, APIs, everywhere. And what do you have to do when you push it into the machine? You need to normalize all these inputs in a way that the orchestration machine, our platform understands and can do things with. And then piggybacking on that, having, I worked for a company one time that had 4+ deployments of SolarWinds everywhere. And some of these teams didn't even know that other teams had SolarWinds running. It was kind of crazy, but the same thing happens with automation stuff. There's a lot of big companies out there that have numerous ways of doing automation, and they might have purchased different platforms, and the left arm just doesn't know what the right arm's doing. So this is kind of where we have this single execution platform that you can actually scale across teams. And this is these two things are what's actually really important for the one hit on this too, but the guardrails. it only should run under the right conditions. And those conditions are always different for teams and companies. And then you have the governance. You got to keep track of, who, what, when, where, why. So combining these two things, I think, and also in Gartner research, getting into this agentic AI stuff is predicated on getting these two things down pat. So what are we doing with, this is an AI conference, isn't it? So what is Itential doing with MCP? So we have an MCP server that we launched in Prague at AutoCon this last year. And I think what makes I'm just going to pull all these up. I know we're short on time, and I don't want to take any time, maybe give some time back, but a lot of MCP, I've looked at so many MCP servers, how MCP servers are going to market. Are they public or private? Or, do you pay for them or do you not pay for them? Like how do you do all these things? And a lot of times if you go out and you look at the market, a lot of these MCP servers they're basically just taking, if they have an API, their open API spec file, and they're putting it through some tool to generate an MCP server. It's dynamically generated, so they have to do that every time like new features come along. But then there's more robust and more advanced MCP servers, and Itential's lucky that we had Peter Spergata, who brought Ansible for networking to market. He's got quite the brain, and he went through and built this incredible way of bringing in tools all ephemerally. So basically we have, if you think about all the assets you might have on a platform, you have the static ones that you create on top of the ones we provide that you might want to clone the repo and put in and generate. But then you have like the assets that are in the platform that you've already built, like the existing like workflows or jobs, all these different things that, you want to use those too, don't you? You don't want to start from scratch. And then, we integrate with a lot of different vendors out there. So if you think about, I guess the right way to say it would be like wrappers on API endpoints essentially, but bringing in our integration capabilities. So like if you have an integration with another vendor in the platform, bringing those in and being able to use those at runtime as well, and having these things dynamically generated and only kind of piggybacking on the guardrails and the governance. Hey, we're going to wrap that there. So you're only letting specific tools and all these things accessible to specific users at any given time. So I think that's on Selector and Itential integration. So I won't talk too much on this, but at the end of the day, Selector does so much good work with getting that context. Kind of back to the BGP example, like those things. We're in 2025. There's got to be a better way at this point for some of those types of things. And so grabbing that context and being able to automate that ticket creation and all the things we had to do in that run book that I talked about earlier, Selector bringing in that intelligence and then having something like Itential to take action on that intelligence. And, that'll slowly get you to where you can slowly start trusting and then get to the point to, if agentic AI is your goal for network operations, that's how you get there. Slow, trustworthy testing and knowing what you have and what you're doing. So there's no shortcuts. I know somebody else said that today, and I firmly believe that with this stuff, more than ever, because you can break stuff much faster now, as we saw from the outage slides. There's no shortcuts. You have to put in the work. So if you want to, I started trying to do tech evangelist type stuff, content. I can't push out nearly as much as John over there, but I do try. And, I will eventually put the slides up on GitHub probably in the next few days. So thank you so much.